Welcome to the United States, the financial illusionist making money appear while the rest of the world applauds and pays the bill. But how did this happen? How did one nation turn green paper into global power? Today, we're exposing the system that keeps America rich, and finally answering the question that no one dares to ask. What happens if the world stops playing by the dollar's rules? Now, before the dollar bill ruled the world, the US was rising fast, an industrial beast pumping out steel, railroads, and ambition. By the 1920s, America had the biggest economy on Earth, and everyone was partying like nothing could go wrong. But it did. In 1929, the stock market crashed, and this wasn't just a bad week on Wall Street, it was a full-blown collapse. 9,000 banks failed, unemployment hit 25%, and families lost everything. The Great Depression wasn't a slowdown, it was an economic freefall. Enter the New Deal. Franklin D. Roosevelt launched massive public projects, created jobs, regulated banks, and gave Americans a reason to believe again. Then came World War II, and guess who became the factory of the planet? Yep, the US cranked out tanks, planes, and soon, global dominance. July 1944, while World War II was still raging on, 730 delegates from 44 allied nations gathered at a sleepy resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their mission? Build a new global financial system. And spoiler alert, the US brought the biggest toolbox. The US had the strongest economy, the most factories, and here's the kicker, almost 70% of the world's gold. Why? Because when the bombs started falling, Europe didn't just send their soldiers, they also sent their gold, straight to American vaults. London, Paris, Warsaw, everyone shipped their treasure across the Atlantic for safekeeping. But here's the plot twist. Not everyone was excited about handing the keys to the world economy over to old Uncle Sam. Leading the British delegation was none other than John Maynard Keynes, the rockstar economist of his time. Keynes proposed a bold idea. Instead of using any national currency, the world should adopt a brand new neutral one, the Bancor. Why? Because Keynes feared exactly what ended up happening, that if one country's currency became dominant, it could abuse that power. But across the table sat Harry Dexter White, a senior US Treasury official and the architect of America's financial plan. White had a very different vision. The world would use the US dollar, backed by gold, as the global anchor. And guess who held the gold? The US had the power, the industry, and 70% of the world's reserves. So when push came to shove, Uncle Sam didn't suggest, he dictated. Keynes argued for balance, White argued for dominance, and in the end, dominance won. The result? Every major currency was pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. The Soviet Union stormed out of the party, calling the new institutions branches of Wall Street. But the rest of the world, exhausted, bombed out, and broke, well, they just all went along with it. The US had the gold, the power, and they had their dollar on top of the world. But this wasn't a victory. It was actually the beginning of a trap. After locking in the dollar's crown at Bretton Woods, the US looked across the Atlantic and saw a continent in ruins. World War II had ended, but Europe was shattered. Their cities were destroyed, its economies were collapsing, and millions were barely surviving. That's when US Secretary of State George Marshall dropped the plan, literally called the Marshall Plan. The pitch? $13 billion in aid, or around $140 billion today, for Europe to rebuild. The catch? You had to spend it on American stuff. You want food? Sure. Want machines? Yeah, we can supply it, no problem. Just make sure it says made in the USA. For Europe, it was a lifeline. For the US, it was genius. Save the world. And boost exports? I mean, it was capitalism with a cape. But not everyone loved it. The Soviet Union saw it as a Trojan horse for US influence and told Eastern Bloc nations, take the cookies and you're out. Still though, the plan worked. Economies rebounded, American goods flooded the continent, and the dollar, well, it became the blood in Europe's new economic veins. But turning the dollar into a global addiction, that kind of power always comes with a cost. After flooding the world with dollars through the Marshall Plan, the US economy thrived, but by the late 1960s, cracks began to show. August 15th, 1971. President Richard Nixon addresses the nation and declares, "I have directed Secretary Connolly to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold." Spoiler, it wasn't temporary. The world never returned to the gold standard. For decades, the US dollar was backed by gold at $35 per ounce. This system instilled global confidence. However, by the late 1960s, the US was printing more dollars than it had gold reserves. Why? Well, massive spending on the Vietnam War and domestic programs. Meanwhile, Europe's economy had recovered and was producing its own goods, reducing its reliance on American products. Countries like France began demanding gold in exchange for their dollar holdings. In 1965, France sent a battleship to New York to retrieve its gold reserves. The US then faced a dilemma: honor the gold standard and deplete its reserves, or break the system. Nixon chose the latter. By closing the gold window, the dollar was no longer backed by a physical commodity, but instead by trust alone. Overnight, money lost its anchor. Economies scrambled, markets panicked, and the rules of the global game changed forever. But the US did have a backup plan. One that involved oil, deserts, and a powerful new addiction: the petrodollar. After unchaining the dollar from gold, the US needed a way to keep it glued to global power. Enter oil. Take a guess at who the world's biggest oil guzzler is. Yep, it's the United States, slurping down over 19 million barrels a day. In 1973, oil prices went through the roof. Global panic, supply shocks, OPEC slapped an embargo on countries supporting Israel, and suddenly, the US realized it wasn't calling the shots anymore. Gas station had lines around the block, and the American dream literally ran out of fuel. So the US struck a deal with Saudi Arabia: sell oil only in US dollars. In return, America would offer military protection and weapons. Sounded like a win-win deal, if you like oil and tanks. Soon after, other oil-rich nations followed and also started pricing their oil in US dollars. Why, you ask? Because Saudi Arabia wasn't just any player. They owned around 16% of the world's oil reserves. That's second place globally. Now, when the guy with the biggest fuel tank sets the rules, you don't complain. You start pumping in sync. Nobody wants to be the weirdo selling oil in pesos when the cool kids are stacking dollars like poker chips. So this turned the US dollar into the official passport for energy. If you wanted oil, you needed dollars. Period. But wait, it gets even better. The US convinced Saudi Arabia to reinvest their oil profits into US Treasury bonds, basically lending America its own money. Now, other countries saw just how sweet the deal was and decided to jump on it too. Buying up US debt became the global trend, kind of like grabbing avocado on toast, but with trillions. The result? The US could print dollars, run deficits, and the world would still demand its currency. Genius? Absolutely. Sustainable? Let's just say, we'll get to that. With the world hooked on dollars yet again, America found itself in a strange position. Printing money was no longer a weakness, it was a business model. But here's the twist. The stronger the dollar became, the more expensive it was to manufacture in the US. Companies saw cheaper labor overseas, and boom, American factories started disappearing faster than Blockbuster stores. To fix this, Reagan launched an economic cannonball. He slashed taxes, boosted defense spending, and hoped that business would return. But there was one problem: money. So, the US started borrowing. No, not a little, a lot. Like record-breaking amounts to fund military spending, infrastructure, tax cuts, everything. America was now running on credit, like a giant economy swiping its card with no spending limit. But hey, who cares about debt when the whole world needs your dollars, right? Well, welcome to the debt-fueled American dream. You spend, they save, and Washington just keeps the printer warm. Because here's the real trick. As long as the world keeps buying your debt, well, the party never stops. But what if the music stops? So, the US was spending more than it earned, for decades. But here's the magic in it all. The more it borrowed, the more the world wanted it. Here's how it works. The US prints treasury bonds, government IOUs, legally binding promises to repay with interest. Foreign nations buy them, usually with dollars they earned by exporting goods to the US, things like oil, electronics, clothes, you name it. It's a cycle. America spends, the world earns, then the world lends it right back. Now, why would they do that, you ask? Because US bonds are liquid, safe, and most importantly, tied to the global economy. And while governments are recycling dollars, you're stuck recycling hours, day after day. Ever wonder who invented the 9-to-5 grind and why it never makes you rich? Well, we broke it down in The Lie Behind the 8-Hour Workday. The link is down there in the description for you. Be sure to watch it after this, or sometime during your lunch. Anyway, back to the big leagues. If the US goes down, everyone goes down with it. So buying the debt is like buying a seat on the boat and praying to God that it doesn't sink. I mean, imagine waking up and finding out that the dollar just tanked. Boom! Markets crash, countries panic, and your morning coffee suddenly costs $87. At first, the US gets smacked in the face. No one wants US bonds. No one wants dollars. Interest rates will skyrocket, inflation goes nuclear, and the economy spirals into a dropped Jenga tower. Businesses fold, people lose their jobs, politicians sweat through their suits on live TV. Meanwhile, countries holding trillions in dollar reserves are like, wait, our rainy day fund just caught fire? And guess what? There's no emergency exit, no spare currency waiting in the wings, no Bitcoin to the rescue. So yeah, the dollar might be flawed. It might be inflated, over-leveraged, and politically abused. But guess what? Every country, every central bank, every trade deal, they're all plugged into it. The entire global economy is built around this one currency. And whether they like it or not, the world is playing the same game. The rules? They're written in Washington. The US didn't conquer the world with tanks. They did it with contracts, debt, and a really good printer. The world? It's still playing along. Same game, same rules, same king. You think it's unfair? Cool. Just don't forget, it runs on dollars. Subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next time.